Major funding for Benjamin Franklin is provided by
the Northwestern Mutual Foundation. The people of Northwestern Mutual are proud to have supported this remarkable series on PBS, celebrating the wisdom and ingenuity of one of America's most distinguished founding fathers.
Major funding is also provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we will be. The Pew Charitable Trusts, investing in ideas, returning results. Additional funding is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for Public Understanding of Science and Technology, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. By these funders, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you, thank you.
I'd already shown that an electrical stroke could melt small quantities of metal. Previously, we had struck a pigeon dead using only electricity. The experiment today was to see whether electricity could kill an animal as large as a turkey. We knew the shock would have to be very great. Everyone in the room was excited, talking to me and to each other, and stupidly, I forgot I was holding the conductor connected to the negative pole of the battery.
Mr. Franklin.
I'm a trifle ashamed of this blunder. A bigger charge, and I might not be talking to you now. It certainly would have been the easiest of all deaths.
Franklin is a wonderful example of a very powerful mind with a very powerful curiosity, immense gifts, and considerable flaws in action.
He presented to the world a face of folksy charm, but beneath this surface lay the fire of enormous ambition. The range of Benjamin Franklin's achievements is astonishing. The inventor who saved the world from the terrors of lightning and the diplomat who rescued the American Revolution is also the author of one of the most widely reprinted books since the Bible.
Franklin would relish the communication and digital revolution we're going through today. And I'm sure he would have been one of the first people in America to have created a website and then also probably created an online service so he could make money off of the website, because he loved the idea of spreading information, thoughts, discourse.
He is the touchstone for every single pivotal point in early American history. His signature on the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty with France, Constitution, is symbolic of Franklin's impact on American history. He signed the documents, but he was the documents.
He basically was a down-to-earth, pragmatic person, somebody who not always practiced what he preached, but always had the detachment and sense of irony to know his true soul. And understanding Franklin's soul is sort of understanding the soul of America.
It is the inclination of old men to talk about themselves and their deeds. But just because I'm old, don't feel you owe me any respect. You can listen or not, as you please. I confess right off, because if I deny it, you won't believe me, that another reason I'm talking about myself is to gratify my own vanity. By the way, have you ever noticed when someone is making a speech which they introduce with the words, "Without vanity, I may say," they always say something very vain about themselves right afterwards? Some people think vanity is an evil. I don't. I think vanity is one of the great comforts of life. I've had a very happy life, so much so that I'd have no objection to living it all over again. Well, perhaps I'd correct a few errors I made the first time round. But since repetition isn't possible, the next best thing is to remember that life and to relate it to you.
Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1706. Only 15 years earlier, all New England had been consumed by the Salem witch trials.
This is a world where witches are real, and they are doing the work of the devil. Man has very little ability to control cosmic forces, or even understand how the natural world works.
If lightning did damage, it would be conceived of as an affliction that one had earned.
If the Almighty God should from heaven rain down upon Boston a horrible tempest of thunderbolts, it would be no more than our unrepented sins deserve.
Mankind is at the mercy of an all-powerful God. People have little control over their fate and must passively accept their lot. When lightning hits a house, causing it to catch fire, the fire brigade extinguishes the fire only in the adjoining houses, but lets that house burn to the ground. They see it as the will of God. Devils, unseen forces, and God's vengeance. This is the world into which Benjamin Franklin is born.
My father, Josiah Franklin, married young and came with his wife to Boston in 1682 to escape religious persecution in England. Here he had 4 more children by his first wife, and after she died, 10 more by a second wife, my mother, Abiah Folger. In all, Josiah had 17 children. I am the youngest son, born in Boston in 1706.
Franklin will later make much of his rise to prominence from humble beginnings. His father is a tradesman, a candle and soap maker. This is not a world of privilege, far from it. Josiah is a proud, devoutly religious man. He instills in his son the Puritan idea that you have no real control over your destiny. From birth, some have been chosen to go to heaven, and some will burn in the eternal damnation of hell.
As a matter of fact, Clint Eastwood in The Unforgiven gives the essence of Calvinist Puritanism in one sentence. When he kills a man who says that he doesn't deserve to die, and he says deserving has nothing to do with it. That's Calvinism in a nutshell.
Josiah decides to send the young Franklin to school to be educated as a minister.
He was raised in a religious family. His uncle gave him a gift of a multi-volume set of sermons, as he said, presuming that young Ben might set up stock as a preacher.
In Boston, being educated as a minister means that he is being prepared to be a leader in society. The most powerful and influential clergyman in New England is Cotton Mather. Young Franklin is fascinated by his sermons, which take the most commonplace events of daily life and draw out their moral lessons.
I was emptying the cistern of nature, making water on a wall, when a dog came up beside me and did the same thing. I thought to myself, how mean and vile is our mortal state, our natural necessities placing us on the same level as dogs? From that moment on, I resolved that every time I answered the call of nature, I would evoke some divine thought that would rise up and soar to the angels.
Virtually every aspect of Puritanism was accentuated in Cotton Mather. His Puritanism was to the 10th power. Among his reminders to himself is not to enter or leave a room without doing some good in it.
This, for Mather, is one of the central tenets of Puritanism. You glorify God by doing good for your fellow man.
Franklin was early on thrilled with the possibility that he would become his generation's Cotton Mather.
In his old age, Franklin will vividly remember a visit to Cotton Mather and a moral lesson learned.
He was showing me out of the house, and there was a very low beam near the doorway. I was still talking when he began shouting, "Stoop! Stoop!" I didn't understand what he meant and banged my head on the beam. "You're young," he said, "and have the world before you. Stoop as you go through it, and you'll avoid many hard thumps." That advice has been very useful to me. I've avoided many misfortunes by not carrying my head too high in pride.
Franklin, from the get-go, understood that he was a modest man's son, but he had powers that rich men's sons didn't have. He was smarter than they were, he was more adroit than they were, he was stronger than they were.
In school, Franklin soars to the head of his class. He is promoted and immediately rises up in his next class as well. He is beginning to suffer from the Puritan sin of vanity.
Benjamin's getting snide, he's getting uppity, he's getting impatient with stupid people.
At 10 years old, I was taken out of school to assist my father in his business, making soap and candles, cutting wicks, filling the dipping molds, attending the shop, running errands. I hated that trade and had a hankering for the sea. But my father wouldn't allow it. However, living near the water, I was much in it and about it. I taught myself to swim.
It's easy to get caught up with Franklin on the $100 bill, Franklin in the Duplessis portrait, Franklin in Peale's portraits. He is always the elder statesman. It's easy to forget that he had hair once, that he was a little kid, passionately fond of swimming.
He became an excellent swimmer. He was tall and broad-shouldered and athletic-looking and active.
Few people knew how to swim in the 18th century. As a youth, Franklin has to learn by reading a book by the French author Thévenot.
He looked at the drawings that Thévenot had made of, I think, 40 different positions in swimming, and he practiced them all, one by one by one. He mastered them, and as he adds in the autobiography, he added a few of his own.
I was flying a paper kite while swimming in a pond. I found that floating on my back and holding the string, I was pulled across the pond without the least fatigue and with the greatest pleasure imaginable.
He's in a most difficult position. He's brighter even than he knows. And his intelligence has to find an outlet that it cannot find.
Although he's been denied further schooling, Benjamin is sure of one thing. He's not going to spend the rest of his life as a candle maker. He resists so strongly that Josiah finally decides to apprentice young Franklin to his older brother James, a printer.
He persuaded me to sign the indentures and serve as an apprentice until I was 21. I was only 12 years old at the time.
He continues rebelling once he's been made a printer. He still thinks of himself as the kid who was on his way to the college. So, when everyone in James Franklin's printing shop gets together for lunch, Benjamin excuses himself. And after eating a quick meal, he studies in private.
In the print shop, he has access to a rich assortment of books, very different from Cotton Mather's religious tracts.
When he discovered these books, he just ate them up. They're not talking about religious consciousness. They're not talking about who's saved and who's not saved. Gave him a glimpse of something other than the world he was living in.
He begins a methodical program of self-education, learning everything from geometry to the art of winning arguments using the Socratic method.
When he decides he's got to perfect his own writing style, he disassembles the books in front of himself, word by word, and then rewrites them.
It was an extraordinary intensity of effort that just is awesome.
He would make little notes on pieces of paper, the theme of a paragraph or the various points in the thing. He would put it aside for a while, come back, and then try to compose it. In a few cases, he thought he even made a slight improvement over these masters of English writing.
His brother James publishes one of the first newspapers in America, the New England Courant. Much of the content of this paper appears in the form of fictitious letters to the editor, adopting different personae, but actually written by James Franklin and his friends.
He also begins to receive a number of papers signed Silence Dogood, an obvious pseudonym.
The letters are written by the printer's apprentice himself, Benjamin Franklin.
He had to write under another name because his elder brother James didn't want Ben getting involved in the newspaper.
Young Benjamin assumes the role of a middle-aged widow with progressive ideas and strong opinions on every aspect of life.
Name a vice in which women exceed men. Drunkenness, swearing, and idleness. If you talk to us, you'll learn that a woman's work is never done. As for ignorance, that's completely the fault of men who prevent women from getting an education. Women are taught to read and write their names and nothing else. We have the God-given capacity for knowledge and understanding. What have we done to forfeit the privilege of being taught?
Franklin got the tone of these letters, the pitch of this woman's voice, just perfect. Now here's a 16-year-old boy putting himself in the voice, in the position of a middle-aged widow, and pulling it off. It's absolutely remarkable. And that's what convinced me that Franklin's a genius.
Silence Dogood's letters, 14 in all, appear in the Courant over a period of 6 months. James, and indeed all of Boston, is beginning to wonder who this Silence Dogood really is. 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin can hardly contain himself.
And when he does say, these papers that you've been praising so heavily, and which are, after all, very good, these papers are mine, that doesn't help relations with the brother, the master, who's also supposed to be governing him.
Benjamin was smarter than James, was better as a printer, even as an apprentice, than James was. James would beat him, as masters commonly beat their apprentices. Well, Ben didn't think this was right.
In his 17th year, Benjamin Franklin breaks his apprenticeship agreement. He steals himself from his brother.
Franklin is now a runaway. He has no idea what will happen next, but he is confident, intelligent, and he has a trade. His life in the next 2 years reads like a novel by Dickens. Escapades, mishaps, embarrassments, and conquests. He travels to New York, and then to Philadelphia, where he works for several months as a printer. In Philadelphia, a wealthy man, impressed with Franklin's abilities, offers him an opportunity to go to London, and the young printer jumps at the chance. In England, he will encounter a world that will transform his life.
He falls in love with London. Everybody knew everybody in Boston. The big city, you lose yourself, free from any kind of parental or master control, and it's a pretty freewheeling time for him.
He sowed wild oats with wild abandon. He met women of all kinds. As he said later, he was always very lucky. He didn't catch any dreadful disease.
He is awake and alert, already quite knowing about the variety of human characters. He's 18 when he comes to London, and willy-nilly, in important respects, naive. But he is a quick learner.
Franklin survives in London by working as a pressman and typesetter in one of the city's many print shops. In this publishing world, he meets the notorious Bernard Mandeville, author of Private Vices, Public Benefits. He's enchanted with Mandeville's idea that there is no moral difference between good and evil.
Franklin evolves philosophies which will let him get away with anything. That God couldn't possibly object to evil, God couldn't possibly object to pleasure, because everything that comes to us from God, because God created everything.
He writes a little pamphlet, which he publishes, without his name on it in 1725. He's freed himself from one of the most serious constraints operating in the Boston of his day, and that is, he defines his religion radically differently than that of his family's religion.
Franklin feels at home in London's flourishing coffeehouse culture, where new and radical ideas are hotly debated. England is in the full throes of a revolution of human thought, a revolution called the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment was a new way of looking at the world that suggested that rational thought and planning could lead to change.
It's a reduction of the importance of religion in life, and a much greater emphasis on the here and now and on the improvement of people's lives.
This revolution in human thought allows people to examine all aspects of existence, including the accepted belief that one's station in life is fixed and unchanging.
The basic assumption of the Enlightenment is that we're not born to be what we are, which was the traditional view for centuries, for eons. And once you have that insight, which is a modern insight, you can begin to change things. Education becomes important. You can change what you were born, presumably born to be. You can become something else.
These new and revolutionary ideas, Benjamin Franklin has taken it all in. Now 20, he sets sail back to Philadelphia. He will spend the long journey home working out the lessons, good and bad, learned during his stay in England.
This was going to be a new chapter in Benjamin's life. He felt a certain nostalgia for London, which had pleased him so much, and perhaps a little apprehension of the future.
September 23rd, 1726. 2 months at sea. For all we know, like Noah and his company in the ark, we may be the only surviving remnant of the human race. Philosophers write a lot of fine words on the pleasures of solitude. But man is a sociable animal, and one of the greatest punishments is to be excluded from society.
He's beginning to have second thoughts about whether one can live alone, whether one can be an island sufficient unto oneself. He's been really irresponsible. He's been really having a great time in London. Never put anything aside. The only reason he's able to come back is that some Philadelphia merchant is paying his way. It's beginning to dawn on him that this isn't quite the way to live.
Franklin becomes fiercely determined to change the direction of his life.
Those who teach the art of writing tell us that we must always begin with a plan, an outline of the whole piece. Otherwise, the essay will turn out incoherent. I've never had a regular design in my life, so up to now it's been a confused variety of different scenes. I must make resolutions, some plan of action. From this moment on, I intend to live my life as a rational creature.
He had a great need to put his life in order at that moment. One could almost say he wanted to become a good boy, a good, serious, steady boy.
1. I will be extremely frugal until I have paid all my debts.
As systematically as he has cultivated his mind as a teenager, he now wants to cultivate his emotions.
2. I will apply myself industriously to business. I will not divert my mind with any foolish schemes of growing suddenly rich. Industry and patience are the surest means to plenty.
Franklin arrives in Philadelphia in 1726. After the great metropolis of London, this town of 4,000 with dirt streets and wooden houses seems like a tiny country village. It is here he will start his life over again.
His story is, of course, spectacular. The youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back, as he says, in a world where primogeniture and patriarchy were valued, he sees himself as at the lowest rung of the ladder, and he's intent on moving up.
Benjamin Franklin was in a very difficult position if he thought he was going to rise as a tradesman within the patriarchal structures that existed.
In this world of family connections and patronage, Franklin is an outsider. He realizes that he can never succeed on his own.
When he comes back to Philadelphia, he really launches on a new resolve, which is this new morality that is going to overthrow the sense of unbridled self-interest, and which is going to suggest instead that people will do better working together, living together.
He recruits blacksmiths, shoemakers, shopkeepers, ambitious tradesmen like himself, and forms a club which he calls the Junto.
Franklin's formation of the Junto is the mother of all self-help associations. These are young men on the make. They need connections. Today we would call it networking.
Part secret society, part discussion group, part Rotary Club, the Junto meets in a tavern every Friday night.
Standing questions for the Junto. Do you know any rich people? Do you know how they got rich? Has anyone's business failed? Do you know why? Do you know of any fellow citizen who's done some worthy action deserving our praise? Someone who's committed an error for us to avoid? Do you have any projects the Junto can help you with?
They have debates, they have speaking exercises where they critique each other, not just for the ideas, but for the presentation, for the delivery, so that they're learning a certain polish. They're learning to talk like sophisticated businessmen.
Franklin is now able to borrow money, and 2 years after his return to Philadelphia, he opens up a print shop. Now an independent businessman, he soon realizes that it will take more than hard work to get ahead in the world. Franklin discovers that the very modern idea of image is crucial to his success.
In order to build my credit and character as a tradesman, I take care not only in reality to be industrious and frugal, but to appear so in public. When I buy paper, I make sure to be seen pushing it through the streets in a wheelbarrow. I'm soon considered an industrious and thriving young man, and merchants who import books or stationery choose me to sell them in my shop. Everything goes swimmingly.
The tennis player, Andre Agassi, said, "Image is everything." Franklin is always in control of how he looks to other people.
It would have been characteristic of Franklin at the time to make sure he hadn't oiled that wheelbarrow's wheel so that he squeaked through the streets and attracted attention.
My thoughts now turn to marriage. A single man is like half a scissors, an incomplete human being.
Of course, it was a great day for Ben Franklin, probably a great day for Philadelphia, because that's the day that he saw the woman that he would one day take to wife, Deborah Reed.
The story has become part of the Franklin myth. In 1723, when he first ran away from Boston to Philadelphia at the age of 17, Franklin was a young man fresh off the boat, walking down Market Street with 2 loaves of bread stuffed under his arms and 1 being stuffed into his mouth.
He actually sees a woman standing on the stoop, and she very much remembers seeing him because she thought it was very funny.
Now, 7 years later, he and Deborah agree to get married. Franklin has good reason to want to settle down. He has been having affairs with what he calls low women, and now finds himself the father of a baby boy. Deborah becomes mother to his son, William, and together they will have 2 children, a son who dies young and a daughter, Sally. Deborah proves to be an excellent helpmate. She runs the shop and is a shrewd businesswoman. Franklin's success in Philadelphia is due in part to his practical selection of a very practical wife.
Of their Chloes and Phyllis's poets may prate, I sing of my plain country Joan. Some faults have we all, and so has my Joan, but then they're exceedingly small. And now I'm grown used to them, so, like my own, I scarcely can see them at all.
Franklin now takes over a failing newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He becomes not only its printer, but its publisher, editor, and chief writer. From the first issue, Franklin transforms the Gazette, livening it up with local news and a touch of sensationalism. He puts his stories in the voices of fictitious reporters.
A butcher had a dream that he was killing a calf. When he woke up, he discovered to his horror that he was actually slicing his child in 2.
And he would often make up stories. He would relate gossip. He would sometimes relate as true gossip things that he had simply made up.
In Bucks County, we hear that a flash of lightning came so near a lad as to melt the pewter buttons off his breeches. Lad considers himself lucky that nothing else in that sight was made of pewter.
He recognized in a way that Rupert Murdoch today might appreciate that selling news was also selling entertainment.
The Pennsylvania Gazette also prints serious articles on a variety of subjects. Franklin, who had grown up in the oppressive uniformity of Boston, passionately believes that a free press will encourage ordinary people to begin thinking for themselves.
And certainly the Pennsylvania Gazette is a profitable paper because it exposes all sides of an issue. And sometimes it would be Franklin himself writing a letter under one pen name on one side of the issue, and then the next week writing another letter under another pen name on another side of the issue. And it was good for business, but I think it was also, Franklin thought, good for getting the truth out.
Franklin also begins printing a yearly almanac, the 18th century equivalent of a date book. In the day columns for which there are no entries, he squeezes in little aphorisms. Soon, people from all walks of life are repeating them.
He who lies down with dogs shall rise up with fleas.
Some are funny, some serious, all memorable.
The greatest monarch on the proudest throne is still obliged to sit on his own arse.
The way to be safe is never to feel secure.
Once again, he's encouraging people to examine the world around them.
Franklin is delivering something that's related to the sermon. Franklin is almost always trying to inculcate a lesson that will lead to improvement.
How many observe Christ's birthday? How few his teachings. It's much easier to keep the holidays than the commandments.
He loves to tweak. He loves to insinuate. He loves to grab you and surprise you.
Fish and house guests stink after 3 days.
Love your neighbor, but don't pull down your hedge.
Poor Richard is the ordinary man's philosopher, how to get along in the everyday world. He is the spokesman for sense that is genuinely common.
Creditors have better memories than debtors.
Franklin later collects Poor Richard's aphorisms on money and frugality and puts them in a book which he calls The Way to Wealth. Translated into many languages during his lifetime, the book has never been out of print.
If you want to know the value of money, go try and borrow some.
Franklin uses the profits from his successful publishing ventures to acquire real estate and set up partnerships with print shops all through the colonies. By the time he's 35, this once penniless printer's apprentice has become one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia.
God helps them who help themselves. Everyone associates Franklin with getting rich. That for Franklin, getting rich is an end in itself. Nothing could be further from the truth.
To be really successful in a Franklinian sense, if you read what he writes very carefully, is not to be wealthy and to be conspicuously wealthy, to live in a big house, to eat off good china, to wear fancy clothes. That the sign of success was in your capacity to give back to the community. And that it was in serving that one achieved felicity. Where did the sense of obligation come from? I think there may well be Protestant and maybe even Puritan origins here.
Remembering the lessons of his youth, Franklin now turns his considerable energy to doing good, to improving life in Philadelphia. The country town of 4,000 has become a city, overflowing with 20,000 inhabitants. There are animals everywhere. Housewives turn their hogs out in the street to feed on garbage. Backyard outhouses overflow when it rains. The smell and the flies are terrible. As Philadelphia continues to grow, so do its problems.
I propose for the city I love an effective way of cleaning its streets. Some may think that this is a matter of small importance, that it is not worth considering the dust blown into the eyes of a single person in a single shop on a windy morning. But in a populous city, this happens all the time. Human happiness comes not from infrequent pieces of good fortune, but from these small improvements to daily life.
He's got, at some level, ideas that he's convinced are better than anybody else's. And he wants to see those ideas implemented. The trick is how to do that when you're not king. You're not an earl and you're not a duke, but you are a common citizen in the colony.
Franklin and the junto use their collective power to solve common problems. They form a volunteer fire department and convince tradesmen to pool their resources, setting up the library company, the first lending library in America.
Not the rugged individual, but a group of people sensing a social need can band together, not depending on the government, but taking the situation in hand and exerting whatever ingenuity and whatever strength they have to achieve what they think needs to be done. And I think Franklin did that on a scale that nobody in the world had ever dreamed before. The genius is social. And the voluntary association is Franklin's invention, and it's what builds America.
Working through these associations, he helps establish the Pennsylvania Hospital. He founds a college which is to become the University of Pennsylvania. He proposes America's first organization to exchange scientific knowledge, the American Philosophical Society. The voluntary associations also devote their energies to down-to-earth projects, like paving and lighting the streets of Philadelphia.
He wanted to make life here and now more comfortable for ordinary human beings. And that is new in the world. I mean, people had lived for thousands of years without really worrying about ordinary people. That's the Enlightenment for Franklin, I think.
The scriptures assure me that on the last day we shall not be examined on what we believed, but on what we did. Our entrance to heaven will not be because we kneeled and said, "Lord, Lord," but because we did some good for our fellow creatures.
Franklin was a unique person. He was too smart in too many areas. He was modern in a world that wasn't yet totally modern, so that he really was set apart from other people. And I think it would be interesting to look at Franklin's character as a study in how a man finds himself, in essence, solitary, alone, different from other people, and finds ways to establish connections with them. They're not intimate connections, they're organizational connections, they're political connections. They're sort of a hail fellow, well-met connections. He certainly never found an intellectual soulmate among the men that he knew, and he settles for the kinds of relationships that he can find.
All through his life, Franklin never saw a problem that he didn't try to solve. Frustrated by inefficient fireplaces, he tinkers with a stove that gives off more heat using less fuel. He takes over the inefficient colonial postal system and speeds up the delivery of letters. And for the first time in its history, the post office makes a profit. He looks into the problem of defense on the frontiers and suggests a radical plan for an intercolonial union, illustrated by this cartoon. He tries to perfect dripless candles and invents a simplified clock that needs only 3 wheels. He wonders about the movement of storms and the social behavior of ants.
A lot of people who think carefully about one aspect of life or another, or one public service or another, devote serious attention to those problems or that particular chore, and then relax for a while, recharge their batteries. Franklin apparently didn't need to do that. He'd go from one public problem to a mathematical problem. Franklin's rest, for instance, if he were waiting outside the door to be admitted to an assembly room, would be to do a very complicated mathematical problem, or to think about an invention, how to perfect a man-made object. Franklin didn't really rest in the conventional sense between chores. His mind was simply too active.
At the age of 42, Franklin decides to make a radical change in his life. He will retire from the day-to-day operations of the print shop. To celebrate this event, the artist Robert Feek paints this elegant full-length portrait. Benjamin Franklin, printer, has transformed himself into Benjamin Franklin, gentleman of leisure. He will now have time to pursue the true passion of his life, science.
Science in the 18th century, natural philosophy as they called it, was made up of a number of amateurs, enlightened distinguished and extremely curious amateurs who had to make their own tools for the experiments. And Franklin was absolutely at ease in that world. That was the world in which he could thrive.
Franklin's curious mind now becomes intrigued by one of the great scientific mysteries of the 18th century, the phenomenon of electricity.
Never in my life has anything so totally engrossed me. Well, I was making experiments and then repeating them for my friends and acquaintances who come in crowds to see them. I don't have a moment for anything else.
In Franklin's day, electricity was much more of a puzzle than gravity had been a century earlier in Newton's time. Everybody was familiar with things falling and all, but electricity, it was just a matter of rubbing something and getting some sparks. Where did this come from? Very mysterious.
For Franklin, the pursuit of electricity started as a game. There was an itinerant Englishman who went from town to town showing gadgets that produced scintillas and sparks and could do things.
In one popular demonstration, a group of people hold hands and then receive a collective shock from an electrostatic generator. This game is performed by people around the world.
With the kind of mind and the curiosity he had, Franklin wanted to go beyond the amusement.
The great thing about every one of these parlor tricks, the simple phenomena of attraction, repulsion, was why, before Franklin, no one had any clue.
Franklin puzzles over electricity for almost 10 years. Why is a stream of water attracted to a charged glass rod? Can you kill an animal with an electric shock? At the time, everyone assumed that electricity was some mysterious force created by rubbing two different substances together. Through experimentation, Franklin proves that in fact, the friction does not create electricity, it simply moves a charge from one body to another. When these charged bodies are brought close together, the result is a spark. Electricity flowing through the air.
This theory was based on the concept of an electric fluid, like an electric current, and that this could exist in bodies in a surplus or a deficiency. He called one state plus or positive and the other minus or negative.
Before Franklin, people had no idea what electricity was or how it worked. After Franklin's fundamental insight, the phenomenon of electricity could be understood and harnessed as a force to change the world.
The way Franklin pursued science is totally modern, but we have to understand in his day, it was the exception. He would always emphasize that it was exploration. Nature had things out there waiting for you to find them out. You know that what you will understand tomorrow is greater than today. And you know that because the truth waits patiently for you.
Both give off light of the same color and have a crooked direction. Lightning and this discharge both give off a noise like a crack, and both are conducted by metals. The electricity generated in the laboratory is attracted to a pointed metal rod. Since they are similar in every other way, will lightning too be attracted to an iron rod? Let the experiment be made.
In the previous century, Newton drew a connection between the motion of the moon and a falling apple. In his century, a century later, Franklin drew the connection between sparks in his laboratory and lightning bolts in the sky.
Franklin hits on a method to prove experimentally that lightning and the sparks in his laboratory are exactly the same. They only differ in scale. The events of this fateful day are described by his close friend and fellow scientist, Joseph Priestley.
Secretly, because he was afraid of being made fun of, and with only his son as a witness, he raised a kite into an oncoming storm. Fixed upon it there was a pointed wire, which was to draw the lightning from the clouds. They were in the storm for a considerable amount of time with nothing happening. Then, just as he was about to give up, he put his knuckle to the key and felt a definite electric spark. Can you imagine his excitement? The exquisite pleasure of that moment. He transferred the charge from the key to the electric jars. The jars could then be used to perform the same electrical experiments as if they had been charged by rubbing a glass in the laboratory. The sameness of the electrical matter with that of lightning had been proven.
Knowing this about electricity, Franklin asks himself one more question. How can this knowledge serve humanity?
It has pleased God in his goodness to mankind to finally show them a way of protecting their buildings from the mischief of thunder and lightning. Take a small iron rod with one end buried 3 feet.
In his almanac of 1753, Franklin reveals the details of his invention. A rod of iron placed on the roof of a building can safely discharge a bolt of lightning down a wire connected into the ground. He doesn't patent the lightning rod. It will be his gift to the world.
The ordinary lightning rod, the Franklin rod, is still the basis of the lightning protection code in every single country in the world. It's still today the best way to protect an ordinary house or a structure from lightning damage.
Calming the ogre of lightning, this frightening thing, this had a huge impact on the public imagination. There was an episode, for example, with 2 ships side by side. One had a lightning rod and one didn't. It was both struck by lightning, one destroyed completely. The one with the lightning rod, perfectly fine. First, the clergy felt that he was usurping a prerogative of the Almighty. Franklin said, well, we do not hesitate to protect ourselves from the hail of heaven with roofs and shields, so we should be entitled to do the same with lightning.
In an age of reason, his proof that the lightning discharge is an ordinary natural phenomenon and not a manifestation of the powers of darkness or the force of an angry God was seen as a tremendous blow for reason against superstition.
In 1753, Franklin is awarded the Copley Medal, the 18th century equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Science. This once runaway printer's apprentice is now the most famous American in the world. Benjamin Franklin is 47 years old, by 18th century standards, an old man. His contributions to science were remarkable, but if he could look into his future, he would be astounded. In truth, his life's work has just begun.
Learning is valuable, but on the day of judgment, we'll not be asked whether we have learned languages or philosophy, or even the proper name of every star. The sun and moon will have vanished, The constellations themselves will have disappeared along with all of nature. But our deeds, our good and bad works, shall remain forever, recorded in the archives of eternity.
Benjamin Franklin is remembered today as the great inventor, the man who protected the world from the terrors of lightning. He is also remembered as one of America's founding fathers. But this leaves out much of his story. That this future revolutionary was in fact a very wealthy man with aristocratic aspirations. That for much of his life, he considered himself more an Englishman than an American. It would take Franklin a long time to give up his attachment to England. When he finally did side with the cause of independence, it would bring about the greatest personal tragedy of his life.
To Catherine Ray, begone business for the next hour, and let me chat a little with my Katie. You asked me in your last letter if everyone loves me as you do. Well, I must confess, don't be jealous, that many more people love me than ever before. Since I last saw you, I've done some things for the province for which people thank me and praise me, and now they love me. Or at least they say they love me, like you used to do. But I'm sure if I asked them for any real favors, they would, like you, as readily refuse me. So what's the real advantage of being loved?
In the winter of 1755, while visiting his relations in Boston, Franklin meets a very beautiful young woman, Catherine Ray. He happily agrees to accompany her on the trip home, she to Rhode Island, he back to Philadelphia and his wife and children. Franklin will see Catherine Ray in person only 3 more times, but they will continue to correspond all the rest of his long life.
Your absence from me increases rather than lessens my affections for you. Tell me you're well and that you love me 1,000th as much as I love you. Then I'll be content.
It is a classic situation. A man nearly 50, at the height of his scientific fame, basking in his newly discovered powers to impress and charm a girl half his age. She, in turn, glories in the impact that she's making on this famous man.
I am sending you some sugared plums made with my own hands, each one sweetened just as you used to like. Katie.
Dear, dear Katie, your plums have arrived safe and were sweet, not only from the sugar, but from the touch of your dear hands. Mrs. Franklin enjoyed them as well. Your letters of affection compel me to give you a little fatherly arithmetic lesson. Find yourself a good husband. Then you must practice addition of his money by minding the household finances, subtract all unnecessary expenses, and have no divisions between you. Multiplication? Yes, I'd have happily taught you multiplication myself, but you refused to learn.
She and he carried on the most fascinating flirtation for years. And Franklin claimed that he was trying to seduce her and that she toyed with him and so forth. But I honestly don't believe anything ever came of it. It was a game that he loved to play with women.
With Catherine Ray, as with other young women, Franklin will act the role of father figure, teacher, and flirt. His attraction to young women and theirs to him has given Franklin a reputation as a womanizer. There is no evidence that his playful words ever led to anything more serious, but he is to enjoy the charm and respect the intelligence of women throughout his long life.
Adieu, dear good girl. Alas, I may be going to England for some time. I just couldn't leave without writing you.
A new phase in Franklin's life is about to begin. The colony of Pennsylvania is sending him to England on official business. Franklin has been to London as a young man and is eager to return. He is outgrowing America.
The Franklin who went to England at age 51 is both the same Franklin who went to England at age 18 and an altogether different man. He's of course older, he's wiser, he's a public figure in many countries. The kite, that blasted kite with its key, made him a celebrity. He knew who he was.
Franklin had wanted to bring his whole family with him to London, but his wife, Deborah, is terrified of ocean travel and refuses to come. She stays in Philadelphia with their daughter, Sally. The one family member Franklin insists accompany him to England is his beloved son, William. The father had always involved William in his many projects.
Whether it was on science experiments or in the post office or in the legislature or on the frontier, they were inseparable. Too close, I think.
In the summer of 1757, Franklin and son arrive in London. Now 27 years old, William Franklin is handsome, bright, and eager for new adventures. As a young colonial from a distant outpost of the British Empire, William is overwhelmed.
From the moment I arrived in this great metropolis, all my attention was consumed with the noise and bustle of the streets and the infinite variety of new sights. And now, there are the appointments with politicians and philosophers.
Father and son rent 4 rooms on Craven Street. It is in the center of London, a short walk from the clubs and coffee houses, the offices of government, the theaters, and busy streets of London's dazzling nightlife.
Samuel Johnson celebratedly said he who's tired of London is tired of life. London was the center of much that made being human exciting, and that was for Franklin a magnet.
He reveled in London society, and he had a running account with a wine merchant up the street. He joined 60 different eating clubs so that he never had to cook a meal or stay home for one. He rented a coach. He thought about having his coat of arms put on the door of it. He went around with William tracing their ancestral roots, their genealogy. He was an entirely different Franklin in England from the poor, simple Benjamin of Philadelphia.
He bought the right wigs, he bought the right clothes. He knew when you go to England that you must play the part of a gentleman or you will get absolutely nowhere. And so he fit right into London society just as much as his son did.
Franklin has been sent to England by the Pennsylvania Assembly on a mission of crucial importance to the colony. In the previous century, the entire province had been granted by the king to William Penn, and the Penn family still controls 3/4 of the immense colony. Unlike everyone else who owns land in Pennsylvania, they pay not a penny in taxes.
They thought the colony's government pretty much existed to secure the revenues of the Penn family. For Franklin, that was essentially feudalism, and he despised that, the idea that a moneyed family in Great Britain would use a colony strictly as a source of revenue for its lifestyle.
Franklin's mission is to try and force Thomas Penn, son of the founder, to begin paying taxes. It is one thing to have an important reputation as a scientist. It is quite another to have any real influence in the genteel world of imperial politics.
Mr. Franklin's fame means nothing here. His playing with electricity is only of interest to a particular set of people. Few men of any consequence have even heard of him. The important people, the ones who are to decide the dispute between us, are all friends of mine.
The meeting between Thomas Penn and Franklin takes place in January of 1758. Penn begins on the offensive, denying the fact that the Assembly has any right to tax him. In fact, that it has any rights at all.
I answered that, according to his father's charter, which founded Pennsylvania, and then I quoted it to him, the Assembly of Pennsylvania shall have all the power and privileges of any assembly formed by freeborn subjects of England. Aha, he says. But my father didn't have any authority from the crown to grant this right. And then he laughs, snorting like a donkey. I was astounded.
He's a vile liar. That's not what I said or did. The rights of freeborn Englishmen. Pfft. The Germans settled Pennsylvania because there was good farmland there. They'd never even heard of my father's charter. In any case, it's over. I'll have no further conversations for any reason whatsoever with this tribune of the people.
Thomas is enraged. When I meet him anywhere, he looks at me with a strange mixture of hatred, anger, fear, and vexation. I've absolutely no regrets for calling him a swindler. That description is completely justified. I hope it sticks in his liver.
Franklin was a self-made man. He had gradually clawed his way up in the world, and he had become a world-famous figure. I suppose Franklin thought he was due a certain amount of respect for what he had accomplished. And Penn probably thought that if you weren't born rich, you didn't deserve respect.
Franklin will never win his battle with Thomas Penn. This is not the New World, but the Old. And Franklin is up against something much bigger than one arrogant aristocrat. In the summer, the lords and gentlemen of government leave the smoke and heat of London for their country estates, and Franklin, too, goes traveling. While visiting Lord Shelburne, he amazes everyone with a demonstration of his recent scientific discoveries.
Wherever I go traveling, I always put a little oil in the hollow joint of my bamboo cane so I can perform this small experiment. When I come upon a pond whose surface is made rough by the wind, I pour the small amount of oil onto it. The oil spreads with amazing speed, making part of the pond as smooth as a looking glass.
The waves were all still, and he speculated for pages how to explain this phenomenon. Understanding how it stills the waves is not actually that elementary, even today, as with most things involving hydrodynamics and all the rest. But a good part of it is a change in surface tension. Surface tension is like a film, and the oil disrupts it, lowers it dramatically, so that when the wind comes over the water, it doesn't form waves nearly as well.
Franklin travels around England and Scotland, meeting some of the great thinkers of the age. He visits James Watt and sees a demonstration of his steam engine, which is soon to transform the world. Franklin becomes friends with men like David Hume, the philosopher, Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, and William Strahan, the most important publisher in England.
Franklin has talents and abilities in almost every branch of human science, and he's friends with the geniuses of the country. But he also knows how to chat with ordinary people at their level. As for myself, I've never met anyone who sees things more thoroughly as I do. If we ever disagree on anything, he quickly and with good humor pours in such light on the subject as to immediately convince me that I am wrong.
These were not the great officials, the great office holders of the British Empire. They were people who were significant in another kind of non-governmental world. the world of science and philosophy and letters. Among them, he was at home, and they honored him for his genuine qualities.
It is the densest happiness I've ever had in my life. The learning and wisdom and dazzling people I found there in such plenty will live on forever in my memory.
Provinciae Pennsylvaniae Deputatus.
Franklin receives an honorary doctorate from St. Andrews University in Scotland and another from no less than Oxford University.
Onatissimus vir Benjaminus Franklin Armiger.
Mr. Franklin, with 2 years of formal education, is now the famous Dr. Franklin, honored citizen of the Western world.
Debbie, I wish I could tell you when I'm coming back. I hope if I have to stay here another winter, it will be more agreeable than the time I've spent up to now in England. I must bring this business with Penn to some conclusion. Your loving husband.
My dear, I had a letter from Sister Meekum. Her youngest child is dead. Oh, maybe I told you that before. The marble fireplace you sent arrived safe. Mr. Hall desires to be remembered, and, well, I can't mention all the names, because everybody wants to be remembered to you. Your affectionate wife.
Deborah the Devoted. He left home on and off for 15 years. Now, this is just unbelievable to us as 21st century people. You could leave your home, you could leave your wife, you could leave businesses scattered all over the East Coast for 15 years. How's it going to continue? Deborah is how it continued. A perfect example is in 1757. He says, well, Deborah, I'm going to go to Great Britain. I'll be right back. I know we're getting ready to build a house, but don't worry, I'll be right back, and don't build the house till I get back. He got on the boat, and Deborah immediately began to build the house.
During their long marriage, Franklin and his wife choose to gloss over their partner's inadequacies with words of affection. He calls her his dear child, and she, in warm, compassionate, intensely human letters, also calls him
My dearest child. I had a visit from a man who had just seen you in London, and he tells me you now look well, which, for me, is the next best thing to seeing you. Mr. Mickle lies dead, and he was walking about fine the day before he dropped. Brother Potter is very poorly. 3 weeks under a violent fit of the gout in the limbs and stomach, and he says his heart. I went up to see him and told him to live healthy like me and my pappy. But he thinks he's so much smarter than me, he'd never follow my advice. Adieu, my dear. Take care of yourself, for everyone's sake, but particularly for your affectionate wife.
Deborah does not often complain of Franklin's absence. Too busy living, too awed by the miracle of remaining alive while death stalks all around her. If she ever takes time to meditate upon her fate, Deborah probably considers herself a lucky woman. It is 1762. Franklin and his son William have been in London for 5 years. Franklin is becoming worried that his son is losing himself in London high society.
All my time has been taken up with the multiple diversions and entertainments of this bewitching city. Even now, I should be asleep. The watchman's voice is calling past 5 in the morning, and my candle is almost burned down. Such is my hurried life.
William had mixed with Philadelphia's upper class, but in London he is experiencing a whole new order of wealth and opulence.
Money, leisure, and property. I think it totally ruined the son. The father could put the brakes on and go back to business. For the son, it was a new way of life.
He's tall and proper, very much the beau, but he's acquiring habits of laziness. Not in the least interested in business. He seems to think he's going to live off my money. I've assured him that I fully intend to spend what little I have on myself.
To be the son of Benjamin Franklin must have been terrifically exciting and terrifying at the same time. But the father, I think, really loved William because I think he saw him as his perfect experiment, where he could invent someone he would have liked to have been himself if he hadn't been the son of a tradesman who made soap and candles.
Now Franklin seizes an opportunity to advance his son, which is beyond anyone's imagining.
The whole business was transacted so rapidly that not a tittle of it escaped until it was seen in the public papers. Then it was too late. There wasn't a single thing I could do to put a stop to this shameful affair.
Franklin's scientific fame has given him access to friends in high places, including a close advisor to King George III. Working feverishly behind Penn's back, he pulls off one of the most amazing coups in American colonial history.
We are pleased to appoint William Franklin, Esquire, to be governor of the province of New Jersey. It is our pleasure that you should prepare for him drafts of a commission and instructions.
Royal Governor, the king's representative in the colonies. Up to now, this top job had been given mainly to influential Britons. Franklin has achieved for his son the highest honor any colonist could hope for. In the hierarchical world of commoners and gentry, he has made his son an officer of the British Empire.
It's a great success story. Runaway boy with 3 biscuits under his arm, penniless and wet in Philadelphia, has a son who becomes a royal governor. It doesn't get much better than that.
I have ordered from Chamberlain 2 prints for the governor's mansion. The picture by Wilson of my father, and a portrait of our king.
In 1763, Benjamin Franklin and his son can see nothing but a bright future for the British Empire. England's glory will be America's glory.
For many years now, I've believed that the foundations, grandeur, and future stability of Britain lie in America. Like other foundations, they are low and unseen, but I believe they are strong enough to support the greatest political structure human wisdom has ever built, the British Empire.
He's in his element. He couldn't be happier. He's living the good life as he understood it. And as I like to say, there was no reason it should ever end.
At this point in history, all Americans, not just Franklin, are proud to be part of the most powerful empire on earth. All that is soon to change. It is called the stamp tax. In 1765, Parliament passes a law decreeing that everything on paper, from playing cards to legal documents, is to be imprinted with a revenue stamp, a tax payable directly to the British government. The colonists are outraged. Franklin, separated from America by 3,000 miles and the months it takes for letters to cross the ocean, misjudges the mood of the colonies.
Let's be frugal. Our own laziness taxes us more than kings and parliaments.
Now, Franklin was totally stunned when the news came pouring back across the Atlantic that all up and down the American coast there was this furious outrage over paying this tax, and riots and stamp commissioners were being hanged in effigy.
Franklin makes a huge political mistake by recommending a friend, John Hughes, for the post of Pennsylvania's stamp tax collector.
They're now saying that you had planned the Stamp Act, and that you're the one getting it sent over here.
In other colonies, mobs are ransacking and tearing down the houses of stamp tax officials. Franklin's friend, John Hughes, is hung in effigy and prepares for the worst. Next, the mob threatens Franklin's house. There they meet Deborah.
When the mobs were assembling, Deborah was told that she should leave the house. Instead, she sent her daughter, Sally, their daughter, to New Jersey, where Franklin's son was the governor, and she remained alone in the house and said she was going to defend her house.
But I said I was sure you'd done nothing to hurt nobody, nor had I given offense to any person. So I wouldn't show the least uneasiness or move. And if anyone came to disturb me, I'd show them my resentment and be properly affronted.
A-F-R-U-N-T-E-D, as she spells it, if anybody thought otherwise.
So cousin Davenport and brother came, and we fetched a few guns, and I set up the best sort of defense on the stairs as I could manage by myself. And I made one room into a magazine.
I honor the courage you showed in that time of danger. The woman deserves a good house who is so determined to defend it. Is it the clergy spreading rumors that I had planned the Stamp Act? I should thank them that they don't also blame me for Adam's fall and the damnation of all mankind.
Franklin had learned from science that if the facts no longer support your theory, you must be flexible enough to change your theory. The facts, he realizes, are these. Protests over the stamp tax are colony-wide and deeply felt. If he does not do something quickly, he will be destroyed politically. From a passive supporter of the tax, Franklin becomes its most outspoken critic. He begins a propaganda campaign in the British press, publishing this cartoon showing a helpless, chopped-up British Empire deprived of her American colonies.
What was the feeling of America towards Great Britain before 1763?
The best in the world. They not only respected you, but had a true affection for Great Britain, for its laws, customs,
Franklin is the star witness when the issue of the stamp tax is brought before Parliament. He expresses American opposition to the tax in language that the leaders of this trading and manufacturing nation will really understand.
And if we do not repeal this act?
You will find they will stop buying your manufactured goods. The goods they take from Britain are either necessities or luxuries. The first, cloth and clothing, they can make at home. The second, they can do without.
Parliament repeals the stamp tax. In America, Franklin's reputation soars. He will soon be appointed official agent for 4 colonies and is now unofficial spokesman for all of America. For most normal mortals, all this would be considered a full-time job, but Franklin somehow finds time for his true passion, inventing.
I was charmed by the sweet sound coming from a drinking glass when you pass a wet finger around its rim. What if I could make an instrument with tuned glasses so these sounds could be made by a person sitting in front of it? I experimented with various forms the instrument would take and had glass blown to different sizes accordingly. I call it the glass harmonica.
He probably saw somebody playing a system of glasses that were mounted in a frame, frantically rubbing their fingers around the rims, trying to play melodies, harmonies, and chords. Well, Franklin took that idea, and rather than rubbing your fingers around the rims, let's get the rims to go around your fingers.
Mozart and Beethoven composed for Franklin's new instrument, and it is famous all through his lifetime. Franklin has always been fascinated with music. Like the modern advertising man, he knows that if you can put your message into a song, people will remember it. In the decade to come, the tune will remain God Save the King, but soon the two sides will be singing different words.
Order! 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 Order!
Parliament has repealed the Stamp Act, but it does not admit defeat and continues to assert its right to tax the colonies.
Power and authority to bind the colonies and people of America
Over the next decade, Parliament attempts to levy tariffs on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And with each new tax, the colonists fight back with protests, boycotts, and organized violence. Franklin is an agent representing several colonies, and at the same time, an ardent supporter of the empire. He is finding that his role as mediator is becoming increasingly difficult.
I was born in America and have lived a long time in England. There's nothing I want more than prosperity to both. I've written and talked so much on the subject that people are getting tired of hearing me.
He's trying to straddle the two sides that are emerging, and there really are two sides now. And the empire is a different thing for him, and he's grappling with this problem of how to hold it together.
In my most despairing moments, I think of that story of the sleeping man, dreaming about how to save his house. In his dreams, he mumbles, "Time is," and then "time was," and wakes up to find his house tumbling down around him and is heard to cry out, "The time is past."
I'm sorry to hear that your gout has returned, and that it's not in my power to be near enough to you to rub you with my light hand. When will it be in your power to come home? How I long to see you. I hope you won't stay longer than this fall. I find myself growing very feeble, very fast.
It is 1771. Franklin leaves London to spend 2 weeks at a friend's country estate. A portly 65-year-old, subject to episodes of painful gout, he too is beginning to feel his age. Looking out over this peaceful country scene, Franklin decides to write, for the first time, the story of his life.
He's depressed, he's dispirited. I think this is a really crucial moment in his life, and it's in those 6 months that he writes the first part of the autobiography.
He started it as a letter to his son. His son was putting on airs, was trying to become upper class. So Franklin starts off by saying, "Remember where we come from. I was a poor kid. I was a runaway. I had a few coins in my pocket when I came into Philadelphia for the first time."
Franklin presents himself as a role model. No soul-searching here, no searing personal confession, but a do-it-yourself manual on how to succeed in the world in an acceptable way.
This is a book of instruction for all those who have the patience and wit to take good advice that's generously offered.
I was 7 years old. It was a holiday, and my pockets were filled with coppers. I went directly to a shop, and being charmed with the sound of a whistle, I spent all my money on it. Delighted with my purchase, I whistled all over the house. Then my brothers and cousins began laughing at me for my folly, told me that I'd paid 4 times too much for it, and described all the other things I could have bought with the rest of my money. I began to cry. The thought of having wasted my money gave me more pain than the whistle gave me pleasure.
True to his good Puritan upbringing, Franklin draws the moral lesson from the story.
I grew up in the world and observed the actions of men. One, a miser, gave up a comfortable living and all the joys of benevolent friendship for the sake of accumulating wealth. "Poor man," I said, "you pay too much for your whistle." I see a sweet girl who married an ill-natured brute of a man because he was rich. What a pity, say I, that she should pay so much for a whistle. I think that humanity brings much misery on itself by the false value they put on things, by their giving away too much for the whistle.
The autobiography is the first great book of American literature, and in some ways the most important book, because of the way Franklin's own life incorporates the American dream, the rise from impotence to importance, from dependence to independence.
He's writing for America.
He really means this to be something which will teach Americans how to live. I think that he sees Americans struggling for the soul of the continent, endlessly tempted by the possibilities of wealth, endlessly tempted by the open land, by the fortunes that you could make. And I think what he wants to tell Americans is, sure, you feel those surging desires. Sure, you want the wealth which is there, apparently for the taking. I think he's saying that that's not all there is in life, and that you're going to perish if you make that all that there is in your life. You're going to tear each other apart. You're going to lose sight of the common life.
Boston, Massachusetts. The city had been under British occupation. Royal troops had fired on a crowd, and the people responded with cries of vengeance. Distrust of the crown is escalating, and Franklin fears that it will tear the empire apart.
He's trying to tell his American friends, just cool it, just remain dutiful, and we'll get through this tough time. But I don't think he fully appreciates just how enraged American opinion is becoming.
Franklin thinks that he can save the situation with a political dirty trick. He has been shown some letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. The letters suggest that Hutchinson had called for the sending of British troops to Boston. Franklin decides to send copies of these incriminating letters to the Boston radicals. He hopes that Hutchinson will be blamed for all the troubles in New England.
What Franklin tries to do by communicating those letters is say, don't rebel against the king. Act against the governor. It's his fault. Remain loyal to the empire and throw out a badly functioning portion of it, that person.
It is Franklin's desperate attempt to save the empire.
He was profoundly attached to England. He loved the British Empire, which he called a precious china vase. He didn't want it broken. He didn't want the separation. And to the last minute, he was still trying to save it in some way.
As Franklin intended, sending the letters has shifted the anger of the colonists from the crown to Hutchinson. The people of Massachusetts are now demanding his removal. William Franklin, the royal governor of New Jersey, is horrified.
Father, Governor Hutchinson is furious about the publications of his letters and his subsequent treatment by the people. He is gloomy and in low spirits. There's even talk of his leaving for England. Some here are saying it was you who sent the Hutchinson letters. Others say that it was Mr. Temple. I can only assume that it was Temple.
Rumors had been going around for a long time that Benjamin Franklin was the one who sent these letters. William had denied that it was true, believing that it was not true. He could not believe that his father would do such a dishonorable thing. His father finally wrote to him and he said that he was the one who had sent the letters to Massachusetts. William was crushed.
He confesses that it was him, at which point the British government goes ballistic.
There is reason to apprehend that this rebellion in America has been much promoted, nay, encouraged by the treacherous correspondence, advice, and comfort given by wicked and desperate persons within this realm.
In England, it is not to be Thomas Hutchinson who will be blamed for the troubles in America, but Franklin himself. His role as a conciliator, his dreams of a great Anglo-American empire, everything he has worked for since he came to England 16 years earlier, is about to come crashing down around his head. Time is, time was, time becomes the past on Saturday afternoon, January 29th, 1774, when Franklin is called before His Majesty's Privy Council.
It must have been the darkest day in Franklin's life, the day he was called to what is known as the cockpit. in Whitehall, the cockpit where they used to go for cockfights and where that day a Christian was going to be fed to the lion being the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn.
The doctor tells us that Mr. Hutchinson's letters had the effect of turning the mother country against her colonies. In truth, we have standing before us the real incendiary, the man behind those committees who are inflaming the whole province against His Majesty's government. They have well learned the lessons taught in Dr. Franklin's School of Politics.
People were laughing all the time, those lords, and he remained there like a statue, not a muscle in his face moving. It lasted a good hour, and for that good hour, he just stood there motionless.
Dr. Franklin stands as the planner, the inventor, the prime conductor of this whole contrivance against His Majesty's governor. This thief, this wily American.
A lot of politics is personal. He took it personally. And it was meant to be taken as such.
This was the turning point in Franklin's life. The man who had been so loyal to the empire, who came to England and stayed there and talked about ending his life in England, to be humiliated like this in front of this array of aristocrats, that made Benjamin Franklin a revolutionary.
Dear Debbie, you'll have heard by now that they have taken away my position as postmaster. The accusation is that I'm too much attached to the interests of America. They intended to disgrace me. In fact, they have done me an honor. I expect to be at sea by the time you get this letter. You will find your pappy has become an old man. And it seems only yesterday that you and I were considered to be one of the boys and girls. So swiftly does time fly.
Christmas, 1774. Honored Father. Noon Monday, Mr. Bache sent his clerk with the news. My poor mother had died. She had had a stroke some time ago, and when I last saw her, she knew she didn't have much longer to live. I truly wish you had come back this fall. I think her sadness in not seeing you for so long preyed on her spirits.
In March of 1775, Franklin sails home to America. The death of his wife is only one of the many catastrophes engulfing him. What he once saw as that precious china vase, the Anglo-American Empire, is in the process of breaking apart. Almost as a relief, he revisits a scientific problem that has puzzled him for years. The fact that it takes several weeks longer to sail west to America than east to England. Taking a series of careful water temperature measurements as the ship crosses the Atlantic, he confirms the existence of a warm river of water within the ocean itself, the Gulf Stream. His accurate charting of the Gulf Stream becomes crucial to navigation and is basic to our understanding of weather patterns to this very day. April 19, 1775, the battles at Lexington and Concord. Franklin arrives in Philadelphia 2 weeks later to find the colonies in turmoil. He sees that most Americans are not eager for revolution. They are desperate to resolve their differences with the mother country. It is a beautiful spring day as William Franklin, the royal governor of New Jersey, rides through Philadelphia to meet his father. Father and son have not seen each other for 12 years. As the elder Franklin has become more radical, so the son has become more conservative.
He identified more and more with law and order as royal governor and saw the revolutionaries as crazies and dangerous. They would pull the whole structure down. Benjamin, on the other hand, thought the treatment that he personally had received in England was emblematic of the way America had been treated. I think the father feels that he can straighten his son out and the son will be on the same side. He'll be with him.
Their meeting takes place at the country estate of an old friend and former political ally, Joseph Galloway.
Up to this moment, the elder Franklin had been very circumspect about expressing his real views to anyone. We passed the bottle around freely, and the doctor finally opened himself up to us. He declared himself in favor of any measure which would attain complete independence. He saw the government in power in England as thoroughly corrupt, and he felt that the resources of the colonies were immense. He was convinced America would prevail.
So we see them sitting around and passing the cup back and forth and drinking by the fire as the father recites his version of history. And we see William's anger developing, his resentment.
There are, in truth, only two possible paths. One which will lead to peace, the other to anarchy, misery, the horrors of a civil war.
England has become a place of injustice, bribes, and foolish quarrels. Our connection to that rotten old state corrupts and poisons us.
Nothing will ever influence me to neglect the duty which I owe to my country. Nor will the most furious rage of the most intemperate zealots lead me to swerve from the duty which I owe to His Majesty.
You say that your duty is to your king, and I shouldn't blame you for differing with me in public affairs. But there are natural duties of a son to a father which come before politics.
William will not be moved. He is an officer of the British Empire, and to the Empire he will remain loyal.
If it's your intention to set the colonies on fire, I hope you'll take care to run away and not get burned when the blaze is out of control.
You are a thorough courtier and see everything through the eyes of the British government.
He's loved William, and William is as close to him as anybody on the planet is. And there's William betraying him at the moment of his most desperate need, at the moment that he's shakiest probably in his entire life. Not at all certain of what he's about to undertake, not certain whether the Americans will even go for the revolution that he's now keen on.
When his own son refused to join him in this revolution in which Franklin was risking his life and his reputation and his property, this seemed to Franklin an absolutely unbelievable, unspeakable betrayal.
The elder Franklin will later describe his son's refusal to support him as giving him more grief than anything in the world.
He thought his son had betrayed him by taking the wrong side. For Franklin, there were no two ways about America's leaving England. There was not going to be any British Empire in which Americans were subject to Englishmen. That was not going to happen.
Franklin, 70 years old, now joins with the most radical leaders in America. He is promoting not just separation from England, but a revolutionary new idea that ordinary people can have control over their government, that America does not need a king. On June 25, 1776, Benjamin Franklin is in Philadelphia, working with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on a draft of the Declaration of Independence.
I think that it is the natural right of men to quit when they please the society or state or the country in which they were born, and either join with another or form a new one, as they may think proper.
On that same June day, in New Jersey, William Franklin is arrested by a government he adamantly refuses to recognize. He writes to his own son.
Dear son, I must go. I'm sick, but it was with great difficulty that I persuaded their low mightinesses to postpone my departure. Congress sent 2 doctors to make sure my illness was not feigned. Hypocrites always suspect hypocrisy in others. I must leave tomorrow, either dead or alive. God bless you. Be dutiful to your grandfather, to whom you owe many obligations.
William Franklin is thrown into prison and will end up an exile in England. The father had once made William an officer of the British Empire, and now it is the father who refuses to help his son in any way. Benjamin Franklin takes his anger with him to the grave, beyond the grave, for in his will, his once favorite son will get nothing.
You fought against me in the last war. I leave you nothing more of my estate than what you tried to deprive me of.
I don't think there's any question that Benjamin Franklin was a great statesman. And I have no question that he was a brilliant inventor. I think he was a wonderful journalist and writer. But I think he was very hard on family and friends. And no different than an awful lot of leaders who are put in the public eye, and we expect them to be saints in private as well as giants in public. Franklin destroys everything around him to create something new. He destroys the old British order. He destroys aristocracy. In the process of creating something new, he destroyed what was closest to him. His relationship with the person closer than anyone to him, his son.
The publisher, William Strahan, is a good friend of both men. He writes to Benjamin Franklin on the eve of the Revolution.
6 years ago, you predicted to me much of what has happened, but much of what you yourself did help fulfill this prophecy. And now you've carried things too far. There will be no end to the public calamities. I see many worthy, loyal men driven from their homes in America. I see pictures of misery and anarchy when the business is done. You could have continued in the exercise of study and in the company of fellow philosophers. Instead, in the evening of your life, you choose to embark upon this, the most arduous, dangerous, and uncertain cause that ever man has engaged in.
Explore the amazing life of Benjamin Franklin at PBS Online. Recreate famous experiments. Sample Ben's wit and wisdom. And discover how his ideas shape our world. Log on to pbs.org.